when the apps became legalized in New Jersey about 7 or 8 years ago, that's when everything changed for me.
Purim is a big day where people, drinking is okay and levels of drinking that normally would not be tolerated. But, it's just once.
I think you're playing with fire with those things. You don't know who's going to be the one that gets addicted. It could be your son. It could be your friend's son. You just don't know. I would say with Purim, the drinking, the smoking, I mean, everything starts with your first experience, right? And I would say, what's the point ultimately? You're gaining so little benefit to have a risk of lifelong pain and suffering. Most kids that I speak to, most Jewish kids who are alcoholics or drug addicts, a lot of it starts on days like Purim, where things are sanctioned, and this is the one day that it's okay. But our brains don't work like that. Once you get the taste of something, once you get exposure to something and you enjoy it, you want to do it again. And I've spoken to kids about this, and I told them I would give anything to go back to that eighth grade version of me or back into high school and never place that first bet, because this is a progressive disease that only gets worse, and it never gets better.
Shalom Aleichem, and welcome to Stark Tank. Stark Tank is a podcast about the challenges and opportunities of being a mentor in the workforce. A few weeks ago, for the Super Bowl, we had an honest conversation with Ramosha Benovitz about B'nai Torah and spectator sports. And there was one angle that we didn't really talk about, but I do think that it's worth bringing up and discussing because it's a growing issue among many, many people in our community and beyond, which is the issue of sports betting. And I'm very honored to be joined today by Uri Idel. Uri has gone through quite a journey with sports gambling and addiction, and I really appreciate the fact that Uri took the time to speak with us today and to share some of his personal experiences. So welcome and thank you for coming today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So let's start from the beginning. A little bit about your sort of personal background, where you grew up, your professional background, what you do professionally, before we get into your gambling story.
Sure. So I was born in Toronto, Canada. I'm the middle child of five boys, so we had quite a raucous household growing up. But I was born into an amazing family, loving parents, grandparents, amazing brothers. I went to Yeshiva Or Chaim for high school in Toronto. I then went to Yeshiva, I went to Israel for 2 years, and then I went to Yeshiva University afterwards, where I got my major in biology and in chemistry. I had dreams of becoming a doctor, but I think at some point I didn't want to spend the next 12 years in medical school. So ended up going back to school for graduate school. I went to Rutgers and UMDNJ for an MBA and a master's. And since then, I've been spending my career in the pharmaceutical industry. So I work in marketing and business development for a major biotech company right now.
Amazing. And so I guess I want to divide the next sort of part of this conversation, your story, into two parts. I think there's like a big line to draw between your gambling story before sports betting became legalized in various parts of America and after. So let's start with that part one. Tell us a little about your very early experiences being exposed to this world of gambling addiction.
Sure. So, going back, I remember the first bet I ever placed. I was an avid hockey card collector. And in eighth grade, I had 47 out of 50 in the hockey set. It was called the Blade Runners hockey set. My friend, who had just started his collection, had 3 of the cards that I was missing to complete my set. We decided to make a bet for it. If I win, I get the 3 cards that he has and I complete my set. And if he won, he would get all 47 of my cards and instantly complete his set. So probably the worst odds of any bet I've ever made. And I lost. And I remember just that empty feeling that I had, just like the sadness, the anger, and all I wanted was to get even. All I wanted was to win that back. And that's kind of where it started. Since then I started, in eighth grade and going to high school, starting with fantasy sports, joining every pool that I could join. I started to bet on games with friends. We would bet on one-on-one basketball, on ping pong, really anything that I could bet on. I started to fall in love with just the excitement around it. I think where it really started for me was in ninth grade. I won my first ever, official sports bet. In Canada, it's legal to gamble at the convenience store. They offer this thing called Proline, which is where you could bet on sports. So we had convinced our high school janitor to drive us to the convenience store, and we placed bets on that night's hockey games. I did my first ever sports parlay, which is when you pick a number of games that all have to win for you to win money. And I won it. I won my first ever bet. And I remember the excitement going back to high school and showing everyone running through the halls and being this cool kid. I had skipped a grade when I was younger, so I was in class and in my grade with kids that were much older than me. So I had this desire to fit in, to be the cool kid, to be a big shot ultimately. When I won that first bet, I remember the excitement, the high that I felt, just like a high that people feel on drugs or alcohol. It was the high that I felt on winning that bet. And since then, I spent the next 25 years chasing that high. And, looking back, winning that first bet was actually a death sentence for me ultimately because, you know, winning early is really a major problem when because you get the taste of it. You feel the excitement of what a winning bet does to you. And addiction doesn't start with years and years. It starts with just winning one time and feeling that feeling.
I'm just curious, just to give us a little more of a picture, like what years are we talking about? And that first sort of win, like what type of money was that when you got that first parlay?
I think this was talking 1999 or 2000 was when I was in ninth grade. I remember putting $20 down and picking 6 hockey games. I remember they all had to go to overtime was the bet. So it was a crazy bet, and I won $2,000, which
Mhm.
for a ninth grader, for anyone is crazy money, but for a ninth grader especially. And since then, throughout high school, I got hooked on that. I would spend all day in class, make filling out tickets, getting my janitor to drive me to the convenience store. I didn't have any of my own money, so I started taking money from my parents, when I could, or I would ask them for money. And when they wouldn't give me, I would, take from my mother's purse. Things that behavior that looking back on obviously was really problematic for me. It didn't seem like a problem at the time. Um, I had a brother who struggled with drug and alcohol addiction. So I never did drugs in high school. I never drank. I was really a good kid ultimately. But gambling was my outlet. That was how I justified being someone who just placed bets and I really wanted just fitting with my friends.
On that point, and maybe two things that you just mentioned that I wanted to dive a little bit deeper on, which is that someone, sitting at home listening to this says, okay, Uri was maybe had some social issues or challenges as a kid. We also had a family history of addiction. So maybe some of these things are more due to or attributed to the fact that other factors, and, maybe for me or my family, it's not going to come because we don't have the same issues. So can you talk a little bit about how the various, social challenges and other things going on in your family, to what extent those may have contributed to you becoming a more intense addict, which we'll get to, or is this something that can hit anybody? How do we sort of think about these factors?
I don't think anyone really knows the answer to that ultimately. I think addiction could happen to anybody, right? It could be genetic with family genes that affect it. It could be your surroundings, the friends that you keep. It could be some of the situations that you're in. But ultimately, when with addiction you're chasing something, whether it's a need to fit in, whether it's an emptiness that you have in your life, whether it's just a feeling that you want to have more and more and more. So I don't think anyone who becomes addicted, again, it doesn't start at once, right? I think for me it took me 20 years to admit that I was addicted to this. um, but with addiction, you never know who's going to be the one that gets addicted, right? I certainly didn't think I was going to be the one that got addicted. Everything was great in my life. I had everything I ever wanted. I had a great family, great friends. I was in a great school. So you really don't know who's going to get addicted ultimately. And I think, obviously we'll talk about my story a little bit later, but when I went to rehab and met many other, people that were suffering with addiction, none of them thought it was going to happen to them. And that's the risk with this. You just don't know who it's going to affect, right? And it could be a whole host of reasons why you get addicted to something. But ultimately, that's a big risk to even try something because you don't know if that's going to be you that it happens to.
Okay, so let's fast forward a little bit to, I guess you told me the exact year, around 2007, 2018, sports betting became legal in various states. So tell us the sort of, right, just to fill in the gap, right, throughout the years between 99 and then you were sort of involved at different levels of gambling here and there, nothing too crazy intense, correct me if I'm wrong. I had heard some of your story, going into this conversation. So if I'm misrepresenting you, let me know. But otherwise, sports betting became legal and a whole world of new gambling opened up to you. So maybe just take us to that point and what happened to your life then.
Yeah, I would say after high school, I went to Israel and I thought this would be behind me because who's going to gamble in Israel? And it didn't stop for me there, right? I started gambling. I found a kiosk in the mall where I was in yeshiva where you could bet on Israeli basketball or other sports. I did it there. I had some casino experiences while I was in Israel. And I came back to YU. I was betting through these illegal websites where you could still bet on sports, but it was not legal at the time. And I would go to the casino when my friends would go. But again, it wasn't something that I did constantly. It was an outlet that I used here and there. Looking back, I would say I did not have a major problem when I was in Israel and when I was in university. But when I would go gamble at the casino, I would obviously go hard, right? Because well, that was my MO. When I would go to the casino, I would just try to win as much as I could. But I would say, I got married, in 2007, and then I started, I went to business school, and then I started making my own money, right? So then I had access to an income finally. And again, I was still gambling on these illegal websites. I was still joining every pool that I could join, and it was still a major part of my life. But I didn't think I had a problem then. I did keep it from my wife. I was the one who managed the finances. I was the one who took care of the expenses. So I started to build this fortress around my addiction so that she would never find out that, the money going in and out was only something that I saw. But again, it was something that I did, but I didn't think it was something that was really a major problem for me.
You said that you didn't think, looking back on it, did you have a big problem, a little problem, a medium problem at that time?
I still had a big problem, right? It doesn't matter how much money you're betting or losing. It really is ultimately it's an emotional disease, and it's kind of how much time you spend thinking about it. And even when I wasn't betting, I was thinking about it constantly. I was always researching picks and different pools that I could join. I had all these fantasy leagues that I was in. So while the money wasn't at the time crazy, it was still occupying all of my time. So yeah, looking back, it was still a major issue. It was a major issue back, when I was in Israel and when I was in high school. But from a financial sense, it wasn't something that really buried me until later. When the apps became legalized in New Jersey about 7 or 8 years ago, that's when everything changed for me. That's when this addiction went from something I did occasionally, something that I had to coordinate on an illegal website and had to limit my bets on there, fantasy leagues, everything that I did all became accessible 24/7 in the palm of my hand. I remember going into the DraftKings and FanDuel Sportsbook. It started with these daily fantasy lineups. So you would be able to join these daily fantasy tournaments and you could put in a hockey lineup, a golf lineup, a football lineup, and compete against thousands of other people. And obviously, if you have the perfect lineup, you can win a ton of money. And that's where I really got started on these apps is putting in hundreds of lineups every single day, researching, all the time I spent researching all these combinations, think that I could beat this machine, you know. And yeah, there were some wins in there, but ultimately, I started to lose a lot of money through these daily lineups. And then the sports book became legalized. So now instead of just betting on the random and on the occasional games here and there, now every single game was on the app. You could bet on football, on hockey, on golf. You could bet on Korean baseball, on Russian ping pong. It was never ending. And not only could you bet on the game and then just watch the results play out, but there was live betting too. So you could bet throughout the game. You could chase your losses. You could put a bet in at halftime. You could bet after the first goal. There was really no end. And that's when this went into another dimension for me where, I would be winning and losing obscene amounts of money. Some days I would have big wins, other days I would have big losses, but it ultimately took over every aspect of my life, just the amount of time I was spending. So the sports book was a huge issue at first. Um, and then where things got really problematic was the online casino. I had told myself that I'm never going to go in there because I know who I am. And I know the second I go onto my phone and start playing blackjack or slots, it was something that I wouldn't be able to stop. And when COVID happened and all the sports went away, I found myself with a gap of not having sports to bet on. So I went into that online casino and I started with blackjack. There were nights that I would turn a couple $100 into six figures in one night, and I would lose it all the same night, and I would win it back the same night. The amount of the swings that I would experience, playing these card games were obscene. Um, and then the slots came, and I was always someone who made fun of people who played slots. I would look at these old people wearing diapers at the slot machines in casinos. It was never my thing, but I started playing, and I think some of these apps, some of these algorithms, try to give you a big win up front so that they hook you in. And yeah, I remember winning big on slots, and for me, that was it for me. I couldn't stop playing. Once you experience a major win pushing a button on your phone, your brain doesn't let you stop playing that game. And it became something that I started to do 24/7. I would stay up all night, playing slots or playing blackjack. I would do it in the morning. I would do it in the shower. I would do it driving to work. I got so addicted that, I work in New York and I live in New Jersey, and and the online casino is only legal in New Jersey. And I would pull over on the shoulder on the highway right before the New York state line so I can continue to play my game and tell myself I'll just do it for another 5 minutes before I have to get to work. And 3 hours later, I'm still there spinning. So it became something that I was doing 24/7 and I could not stop.
Wow. And I guess, hearing the story, it's obviously not, not easy to hear. And, someone, a normal person listening to this hears a person in deep distress and in deep trouble. But when someone from a gambling company, a sports book or whatever, they see their dream customer, their dream client. So can you tell us what that's like? I've heard that, these places will, treat you a certain way to keep you coming back because they make so much money off of you. What was your experience like?
Yeah, I mean, I was offered a VIP host at both FanDuel and DraftKings, right? Which again, to me, made me feel like a cool person, like I was some big shot. But ultimately, what that meant that I was a sucker that was losing more money than 99% of people probably on these apps. But the job of these hosts is to make you feel special, to make you feel like they're your best friend. So I was given tickets to any game I ever wanted to go to, tickets to a suite at the Garden, any concert I wanted to go to, they would give me free tickets to. One time they actually rented out the flagship Tiffany store in New York City, and invited 100 of their VIPs with their wives or girlfriends to come. They had a black tie event, and they gave each of us $5,000 gift card to shop at that store. Which I think at Tiffany's in New York City is not that much money considering how much everything there costs. But I remember buying my wife $1,000 bracelet that I used the gift card for. And again, that they just did that so I would be able to buy my wife something nice and keep her off my back about the gambling, which she still didn't know about. So their job is to make you feel special. And I think the worst thing that they did for me, aside from all these free tickets and events that they offered, was every week I would get free money put in my account. So it didn't matter how much I won or lost the previous week. Every Monday morning, I would wake up. There would be five to $10,000 in my account with an email from my VIP host saying, "Hey Ori, I just put free money in your account. Go enjoy." There were times where I was trying to stop gambling on my own, and getting that email with free money, it just sucks you right back in because now you tell yourself, "Oh, this is not my money now. I'm not losing my own money. Now I have $5,000 of the casino's money to double or triple or turn into an insane amount of money." And yeah, there were weeks where I would win money with that, but ultimately, before you know it, you've lost all that money and now you're depositing and losing all your own money. So yeah, those VIP hosts and those predatory companies, all they want is to bring their whales back, not literally and figuratively, but to bring those people back so that they can keep gambling, keep losing money. Because with gambling, everyone loses. There's no winning in this. I've won huge in gambling, but at the end of the day, every single one who's gambling is going to ultimately lose anything they won and then lose all their own money as well.
So it just, hearing that particular description really like makes me sick. Like feel sick feeling in my stomach. It's the thought of taking someone so vulnerable and preying on them, making them feel special, making them feel good, treating them like they're something important when really they just are in a desperate need for real help just seems so beyond disgusting. And I'm wondering, how does our society even allow for such a phenomenon to occur? It just seems like beyond comprehension.
I mean, it's even beyond that. I mean, if you think about all the advertisements that are out there right now, every advertisement you see is for gambling, right? No one's talking about the destruction this is doing to people and to families. While I don't blame these companies, ultimately I hold myself accountable for what I did. Yeah, these companies are preying on the weak. They're preying on addicts who can't control themselves. I always laugh whenever I see at the bottom of these emails or these ads that says gamble responsibly. You never see someone who's a drug addict being told, "Hey, just use drugs responsibly or drink responsibly." There is no responsible gambling. Gambling is a major problem. It's a mental illness that you can't control. I can never place a single bet again, and I know that now. But at the time, you convince yourself that you'll quit when you hit rock bottom. Or to me, the biggest issue with gambling is that you convince yourself that you're one win away from solving all your problems, right? As long as you keep playing, that big win's going to come. And the problem is, you do get that big win. And I have had, like I said, many big wins over the years. But when you win big, you only want to win more because you have that greed and that addiction that you can't stop. And when you lose, now you have to keep gambling because you have to chase and you have to get out of this hole. And you convince yourself that you're going to get out of that hole as long as you keep playing. So there is no winning in gambling. It's a lose lose proposition. Doesn't matter how much you win, doesn't matter how much you lose. You will keep going and you will get into even worse trouble. And I've spoken to kids about this, and I told them I would give anything to go back to that eighth grade version of me or back into high school and never place that first bet because this is a progressive disease that only gets worse and it never gets better. So until you come clean, tell until you're honest with yourself ultimately that you have a problem, you will only get into exponentially worse trouble with this. And I did that to myself.
You did say that you lost and lost and got worse and worse with a few, wins to keep you sort of afloat or in an illusion that you're going to keep going. But you did end up having a transition. You over the last, maybe 10 or so months have been on a journey of recovery. Tell us a little bit about that journey, what sparked it and what it was like going through.
Yeah. So, I was going to keep going at this as long as I could because, again, like I convinced myself that, once I win big or once I get out of this hole, I'll stop. Or once I hit rock bottom, I'll stop. There was never anything that was actually going to get me to stop ultimately. I burned through all of our money, right? That money goes quick when you're spending tens of thousands of dollars every single day. So I burned through all my money. Then I started to do things that, I wouldn't recognize in myself, if I was, in a normal conscious state of being. But I started, emptying out all of our retirement accounts. I took out every loan that I could get. Started borrowing from family. I went to my parents for multiple bailouts and lied to them about why I needed money. I went to other family members, friends, my brothers. There was no one I wouldn't go to get money from. And ultimately, all I cared about was placing that next bet, right? Didn't matter who I was hurting, didn't matter what I was doing to our future financial situation. I just wanted to get that next bet because I was surely going to win big and win it all back and pay it all back. So financially, it got to a point where I was getting into some serious trouble. I started missing mortgage payments. And my wife is calling me from the grocery store asking why the credit card isn't working. I'd be lying to her, about money that I'm transferring or telling her that once I got paid on Friday, everything would be okay. And Friday morning would come. I'd be up at 4 in the morning when my paycheck would hit my account and I'd immediately start gambling. And that money would be gone before she even woke up Friday morning. So it was getting into this cycle where the gymnastics I was going through in my head to figure out how to get money for my next bet, how to pay the bills that we had, how to get my wife and my kids stuff that they needed that week, how to do my full time job, how to be a husband, how to be a father to four incredible children, you know, while only caring about gambling and getting my next bet. I don't know how I did it for so long, but it was something that I literally had to go through every single day to figure out where all this money was coming from and how I was going to keep this fortress around my addiction so nobody would find out. But I was prepared to do that in silence and, suffer on my own and not tell anyone about it. Because with gambling, this addiction is, as much an addiction of gambling as it is about dishonesty and lying and manipulation. You lie and manipulate your loved ones. This doesn't matter because all you care about is that next bet. But once I realized like what this addiction was doing to my family, was doing to my kids, there were some mornings where I would be up all night gambling and finally falling asleep at 6 in the morning. And my kids would wake me up, half hour later, and I'd be in a rage because I didn't get any sleep and I lost all this money last night. And all that they wanted is their dad to make them breakfast in the morning. And I don't want to have anything to do with them. Right. I would be playing hockey with my son attached to my phone, spinning slots. I'd be driving in the car with them with my phone in my lap, spinning slots or placing bets. I had everything I ever wanted right next to me. And I'm in this fantasy world chasing money that even if I win, I wouldn't stop doing it. So, you know, I was typically a very happy, positive, gregarious type of guy. I was rarely ever in a bad mood, rarely depressed. And this addiction was destroying me. My wife would always ask me what was wrong. I would blame it on stress at work or other things. But it started to affect my family. It started to affect my wife, my kids. They saw what their dad was doing and what he was spending all his time doing. And, it was affecting my mood, was affecting my sleep, my sanity. I didn't care about the consequences of people I was borrowing money from. But once I saw what this was doing to my kids and what it was doing to my wife and my family, I knew I couldn't go on like this anymore. I was sick and tired of living this way. I was sick and tired of waking up every morning wondering where the next source of money was going to come from. I was sick and tired of being a prisoner to this app on my phone where I couldn't take my head out of it. The only time I ever felt relief from gambling was when I ran out of money and I couldn't gamble anymore. Then I could pull my head out of my phone and I can breathe again. If I had any money in my account, that was all going towards this. So to answer your question, I think once I ran out of all this money, once I lost this all, and I saw what this was doing to my family, it was time for me to come clean and so admit that I needed help. And the biggest fear I would say for all gambling addicts is coming clean. Convince yourself you're this awful person, that, your wife or your spouse is going to leave you, that your kids won't respect you, that you'll lose your job, your house. I think there's this big stigma around gambling that, I remember when I grew up and there was someone in the community who was a gambling addict and lost his family. Everyone looked at this guy as this poor, pathetic loser, and how could he do that? And what a terrible guy. So I was petrified of that. I was petrified of coming clean and telling my wife what I did and telling my family what I did and coming clean to the people that lent me money on good pretenses, telling them the truth. And that's what kept me in secrecy for so many years because I was just terrified of anyone finding out about this about me because it was this deep, dark secret that I was prepared to keep hidden for many years.
Wow. So I guess what was that like? You finally came clean. I'm sure that process was a terrifying one and an awfully hard one for you and your family. But once I guess the cat was out of the bag, what were the next steps?
So I came clean to my wife. It was a random Wednesday night at 10:30. She was sleeping on the couch, and I had already pushed this off every single day that week. I told her I was going to tell her on Sunday, on Monday, on Tuesday, and I kept convincing myself that I didn't have to do it or that I shouldn't do it. But finally, one Wednesday night, I couldn't take it anymore. I woke her up. I told her we needed to talk, and she knew something was wrong because that never started. Saying we need to talk never ends with good news at that point. But I came clean. I broke down. I told her the truth and that I needed help and that I couldn't do this on my own. And that really started this kind of domino effect of just coming clean to everyone in my family about this. But just going back to my wife, the initial reaction from her, instead of what I thought would be anger and disappointment and, all these negative things that I convinced myself would happen, she just reacted with love and support. She said, okay, we're going to get you help. We're gonna figure out where you need to go to get this help. The next morning, she was on the phone with my mom the whole time, figuring out where to send me. I came clean to my parents. That was hard. I came clean to my wife's family, my brothers, my friends. The hardest part was coming clean to my kids. We had decided the next day that I was going to go to rehab for a couple of months, or at the time we thought it would be a month, but it ended up being a couple months. And my daughter's 15. I have another daughter who's 12, and then I have 9-year-old twins. And we told my daughter, I think we were advised, don't mention gambling, don't mention rehab, just try to keep it high level. I think she's a lot smarter than that, and she kind of figured out that her dad was going to rehab, and within a few minutes, she had texted all of her friends to let them know, which is what she needed to cope, and I was never going to stand in the way of that. However, she wanted to handle this, is completely fine with me. But within a few minutes after that, the principal of the school texted my wife Tamar and offered words of support and offered to help with anything they need. At that point, I realized this was not going to be a secret anymore. This was going to be out in public. Everyone was going to know about this. The community was going to know. And I told myself that I was going to go get help and I was going to do whatever I can to get better. And when that happened, I was going to use my story to help other people who were struggling with this addiction. Um, this wasn't going to be something that I would just do in silence. I was going to do this publicly and share my story, share how it impacted me, and try to really remove the stigma of this addiction. This addiction is a mental disease. It's an emotional disease. It's not a financial disease. When I was in rehab, I think everyone there I was the only one who was there with a gambling addiction. Everyone else was there for drug and alcohol addiction. And they were all just shocked at how similar my story was to them. The first bet to a gambler is like the first drink to an alcoholic. Ultimately, we're using a substance to get high. We're chasing something, and my choice was gambling. It was a symptom for me. Ultimately, it's an emotional disease that a lot of these addicts suffer with. But I would say that the reaction that I got to coming clean is the only reason I'm sitting here today. is the incredible love and support I got from my entire family. The courage and the confidence to, to tell me that we're going to get through this and that they believe in me, is really what got me through this. Man, my brother-in-law came in and managed all the finances while I was gone. My mother was helping in every way she can. My father, my in-laws, my siblings, friends cooked meals for us every single night while I was gone, so that my wife, who works full time and has 4 kids, didn't have to worry about dinners while I was gone. I'm sitting here today being able to share my story of recovery because of the love and support we got from family and from friends in the community. And now being able to share my story and hopefully help other people, is what motivates me to keep going.
Wow. So can you just take us through some of like the milestones and stages after the inpatient rehab, how you continue to get back to life, start to rebuild um, in a way that's, healthier, correct, stable with, there's obviously relapse is always a fear I'm sure you're dealing with. So let's talk a little about those sort of subsequent stages after you came back from inpatient.
Yeah, I mean, while I was in inpatient rehab, obviously that was a huge step for me, right? I left all the comforts of home and now I'm in Florida, in this apartment by myself. Now I have this budget for groceries. It was a very humbling experience, being there. But I think what it did for me was for the first time in my life, I was able to really focus on myself, right? Obviously, to my wife, my kids, my job, the gambling. I never took a step back and looked myself in the mirror, right? I avoided the mirror at all costs. I didn't want, I hated myself for those years. But it gave me 2 months to really work on myself, really understand the root causes of my addiction, understanding some of my triggers, understanding why I did what I did. But the biggest thing was that it gave me a break from my phone, which was my biggest addiction. It gave me 2 months for my brain to get rewired. This is a really big dopamine addiction, right? Every time you go into the apps, you feel that dopamine. Uh,
So just curious, like they take away your smartphone and give you like a payphone to call home once a week. Is that how it works? Like,
yeah, I didn't have access to my phone the whole time. There was a phone in the office that I can go and call at night, 'cause especially people there with families and kids, they let you call your kids. So I called my kids every night. I got into this new routine where I was working on myself during the day, and at night I was talking to my family. And my wife came to visit me in rehab, and we had obviously had some days there where we worked through some of our issues together. And obviously, she was able to confront me for everything that I did over the years, which I think was very therapeutic for her and for me. But I think through that, she saw a new person, or the old person kind of emerge. This person who's not rooted in lies and dishonesty, but someone who's fully honest and vulnerable, and really being honest with not just her but with myself. So those 2 months in rehab were really important for me to kind of rewire my brain. When I got there, they actually did a brain scan. Um, you know, the risk reward part of my brain was completely lit up red, which I think they say is common in people who have gambling addictions, because there's no concept of risk or reward or consequences, right? All you care about is placing that next bet. You don't care about what it's going to do. You don't care about the risk. You don't care, even the reward part, like you get the reward, but then all you want is more. So being 2 months of learning, kind of, instead of living in the ones and the tens, of being all the way high or all the way low, is trying to live a steady life in the 4, 5, and 6, where you can just, be normal, and where you can get joy out of the simple pleasures in life, which I, never took, which I took for granted for many years. So after 2 months of being in rehab, I had missed pay stuff with my family, which was incredibly hard for me and obviously hard for my wife. But it was important. It was important for me to go and to really do the work well. And again, I made a promise to myself that I was going to do this. And I was going to do this once, and I was going to do this the right way. And most gamblers, I would say 99% of gamblers, relapse in this addiction. And to me, I was so grateful to have a second chance and a new lease on life, that I'm trying to be that 0.1% here that really does this once and does this right. But when I was in rehab, I discovered that I was able to go to my first Gambling Anonymous meeting. And in those meetings, just like Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous, my mind was blown walking into that room, because this whole time I thought I was the only person out there who was dumb enough to be doing what I was doing, who was as addicted as I was, who was losing all my money, playing these games or placing bets, and walking into that room and seeing a room of 30, 40 people who were all like me, right? It didn't matter if they were 70 or 80 years old, or if they were, 25, 30-year old or college kids. Everyone in that room was the same. We all had the same problem, and we were all working to get better. So realizing I wasn't alone, was really important and really helpful for me. Um, In my first meeting there, they asked me 20 questions to determine if I was a compulsive gambler. I answered yes to 19 of them. If you answer yes to 7 of them, you're considered a compulsive gambler. So, I aced that test, but it also laid out a clear path to follow in order to make it in recovery, which included, going to meetings regularly, getting yourself a sponsor, which I did, putting someone else in charge of your finances, and really not testing or tempting yourself by going anywhere near gambling establishments, right? And the biggest thing for me was I started to live this motto, which Gamblers Anonymous kind of tells you, of living life one day at a time. I was sitting there seeing people with 3 months of recovery and saying to myself, how am I going to go 3 months? I've never been able to go 1 or 2 days without gambling. And, living this life one day at a time. You wake up in the morning and you focus just on today. I'm not going to gamble. The days add up. And the biggest thing that happened while I was away is I rediscovered my relationship with Hashem. For so many years, I had stopped caring ultimately, right? The gambling, whether it was the gambling caused it or the gambling was the result of it, but I was not connected religiously or spiritually. I stopped davening. I stopped putting on tefillin. There was no part of my life aside from obviously living a Jewish and kosher lifestyle. I had no relationship with Hashem, and starting to put on tefillin every single day when I was there, which has continued into today. That's been the biggest difference for me is waking up in the morning, putting on tefillin and davening to Hashem and praying that I don't gamble today and to help fill me up with gratitude and love today. So and to take remove some of my shortcomings that I have and some of my poor qualities that I want to get rid of, and just having that conversation with Hashem every morning and then thanking him at the end of the day is really what gets me through this one day at a time.
Wow, it's a really moving story, and I really appreciate you sharing it. So we're going to transition. I jotted down a whole bunch of notes as you were talking, maybe some like to broaden the lens a little bit beyond Uri's story, talk a little bit about what some of the listeners might take away from this and sort of broader communal issues. So maybe just, one thing to pick up on what you're talking about, coming back to life, removing addictions, removing temptations. So we have this sort of phenomenon where, similar to people who have pornography addictions or, digital addictions, is that like, in an ideal world, I would get rid of my phone, but like phones are basically a part of life, a part of society. And, gambling, porn, other things are just so close. So how do you integrate back into a life where these things are around, but you have developed a healthy relationship or a workable relationship with them?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think for me, it was important for me to put in a lot of guardrails and boundaries. Like when I came back, I told myself I'm okay. I'm good to go now. But when you come back into society and now you have your phone again, now you have the thing that you became addicted to. Now you're visiting the places where you used to gamble at. There's a lot of triggers around, right? So a few things that I did as it relates to my gambling addiction was obviously all the gambling apps were deleted from my phone. I installed software on my phone so that I can install any gambling apps. It's called Gamban. I went to the Meadowlands and self-excluded myself for life from all online and in-person casinos. I did that in every state that I traveled to. These are all guardrails, right? Ultimately, if you're a gambler and you want to gamble, or if you're an addict and you want to, use your vice, you're going to do it. But it was important for me to set boundaries for myself. And yeah, it was hard at first to even watch sports. So I didn't for a while. I mean, for me, sports was a big trigger for me because I used to bet on sports all the time. Um, I would still watch, my hometown teams like the Maple Leafs and the Blue Jays, unfortunately, and have to go through that heartbreak. But, for me, sports became, instead of something that I use just to win or lose tons of money on, it became, a great bonding experience with me and my son. We love to watch sports together. But even now, like I'll watch my hometown teams, I'll watch, primetime games of the Olympics, but I'm not a prisoner to my couch every Sunday to watch meaningless football games. There are things out there that I know I can't be testing or tempting myself with. Obviously, I won't go anywhere near a casino, but I won't even watch like football on Sundays anymore because to me it's pointless. I'd rather be spending the day with my family and doing things that are meaningful. So I think for everyone, it's obviously important to know yourself and know what um, know what you're capable of, and know what tempts you. But I would highly recommend putting boundaries in place, whether it's screen time on your phone or whether it's certain software that prevents you from downloading or accessing certain things. I think can only help because when you do get into those urges, it's best to have as many boundaries and hurdles in place to get through before you can act on that urge.
picking up on that point, what you just mentioned, sports has always been considered a pretty, broad consensus of people within our Jewish Orthodox community as a great outlet for kids. There's much worse things they could be doing with their spare time as children. And I guess the question really becomes, nowadays, given the current reality, is that true anymore, or has the sports gambling danger and addiction changed the calculus, changed the way we as a community should relate to it? Should we be finding other outlets like, I don't know, fishing or hiking where there's not yet massive gambling addiction?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a problem today. I mean, kids' brains are very vulnerable. They're still developing, and especially the part of their brain that controls impulse and risk. They chase excitement, they feel invincible, and they don't see long term consequences. So I'm not going to sit here and say kids should not watch sports, right? But like anything, there has to be limits, right? If a kid is saying to himself, "I'm going to watch 5 more minutes of this game," or "I'm going to play 5 more minutes of this game," and then 3 hours later they're still doing it, that's a problem, right? That's something that they cannot control themselves. They cannot stop themselves doing. And especially when watching sports involves, money now, right? So there's a difference between watching a sport, as harmless fun and watching the Super Bowl, between that and having money on a game or betting with friends or having fantasy sports. So once you start to involve money and risk into this, it could become a real problem. I think for parents out there to know, gambling doesn't look like gambling anymore. Most parents are picturing casinos or poker tables. That's outdated. Today, gambling is sports betting apps. It's online poker. It's casino games. It's free to play games that has mystery prizes. It's video games. It's fantasy sports. Things that feel harmless. But if it involves risk, if it involves reward and dopamine, it can hook the brain, especially a young one. My addiction was a dopamine addiction. And once you feel that high, all you want to do is feel that same high again. And the more you do it, now you need to risk even more money to feel that same dopamine hit. I started with tiny $1 bets, and before I knew it, I needed to be betting thousands to feel anything at all. So this is an illness that, it doesn't happen all at once, but it's a progressive deteriorating illness that only gets worse. That only gets worse. So if you don't put boundaries in place now, if you don't start having the conversation now, these problems will get exponentially worse. So yes, sports is still fun. Kids should play sports, obviously. They can watch sports. But when it starts to involve money and risk, and when they're doing this, hours upon hours upon hours, it's no longer harmless fun.
Mm. You mentioned before that you would give anything to go back to that first bet and have a do over on that particular moment. And it's interesting because a friend of mine once told me that we have these experiences in our religious life. Purim is a big day where people drinking is okay, and levels of drinking that normally would not be tolerated. But it's just once. It's just once. Or in certain communities, a cigarette on Purim is it's just once. It's just Purim. It's just fun for one day. So your story seems to indicate that like that is a completely incorrect logic and calculus. So again, are these people who think that to drink one day a year completely wrong? Are they sort of wrong? Is there a different way to think about it? How would you give advice to parents, educators, just regular people thinking about these opportunities that could be just the one day of fun, or could also be a gateway to something really, really bad?
I think you're playing with fire with those things, right? Because like I said before, you don't know who's going to be the one that gets addicted. It could be your son. It could be your friend's son. You just don't know. And with me, gambling was legal, and it was something that I wasn't doing anything illegal. I was doing it occasionally. It started with one bet. It started with a single bet, and that built, right? So I would say with Purim, the drinking, the smoking. I mean, everything starts with your first experience, right? And I would say, what's the point ultimately, right? You're gaining so little benefit to have a risk of lifelong pain and suffering. Most kids that I speak to, most Jewish kids who are alcoholics or drug addicts, a lot of it starts on days like Purim, right? Where things are sanctioned, and this is the one day that it's okay. But our brains don't work like that. Once you get the taste of something, once you get exposure to something and you enjoy it, you want to do it again. And then you want to do it again and again. And then before you know it, you can't live without it. So I do think it's a big risk, right? I started when I went to rehab. For me, I was going to get clean from gambling, right? I was still planning on being able to drink and smoke. And I even remember speaking to the intake guy and saying, I'll be able to smoke weed there, right? And he said, no, it's a drug rehab. I said, no, but I'm going for gambling. But when I went there, I stopped everything all at once. I stopped drinking, I stopped smoking, I stopped taking Adderall, I stopped gambling. And for me, I know that it's a slippery slope, right? Could I have a drink or a cigarette or a joint? You know, I don't know because I don't know what the next step is going to be after that. So for me, I need to live this life completely sober. There's plenty of joys around with my wife, my kids, and I don't need to mask anything with these, with these substances or with these vices. It only has gotten me into trouble, and it'll only get your kids into trouble ultimately. So yeah, I mean, I think it needs to be completely supervised. I think you need to have honest discussions with your kids. At the end of the day, you don't know where these addictions start, and ultimately you're risking some lifelong pain and suffering if any of these kids do get hooked because of it.
Right. So you actually just at the end of that answer, you segued perfectly to the next thing I want to ask you. You spoke about masks, and it's been one of the sort of underlying themes of this conversation, the openness that you've taken, the illusions that people try to live with while they're addicted, that they're going to keep things together, even though their life is honestly just a complete wreck. Purim is also a holiday of costumes, and we have different people in the Megillah who are dressing up or playing different roles. So if I can tie that in as well. But I guess the question is, your approach of, I guess, radical honesty, openness, coming on this podcast, sharing, being very vulnerable. Is that something that more people should be involved in, being a little more open about their problems, less pretending that things are okay? I'm sure anyone listening to that is sort of scared because everyone has their things that they're dealing with. So what are the takeaways for someone who, has different issues here or there, and what can they learn from this story about being honest, being open, sharing, who should or shouldn't be sharing? I'm happy to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I'm not going to sit here and tell people that they need to be public with all their problems, right? That's a choice that I made personally. It helps me with my recovery to hold myself accountable. And to me, I want to be able to help other people go through what I went through because with gambling, it's something that no one's talking about. It's an epidemic out there with kids and other people in the community, in the Jewish community, who no one's talking about it. So if my story could help just a single other person deal with this, that was something that I was willing to do to help others. I'm not telling everyone they need to be public about it. I will say that, what kept me suffering for 25 years was the fact that nobody else knew about my pain. That, on the surface, everything was fine. Nobody knew anything, while underneath, my world was crashing down and I was suffering immensely. The burden that got lifted off my shoulders once I finally told the truth was the biggest relief, the most incredible moment that I've had, being able to just tell someone my pain and to come clean and to ask for help. The reaction that I thought I would get versus the reaction that I actually got was night and day. All I got was love and support. When it comes to addiction, this is not your fault. This does not mean that you're a bad person. It's not a moral failing. This is a mental illness. Just like cancer is a disease and there's other diseases out there that there's no stigma around. Drug addiction, alcohol addiction, gambling addiction, porn addiction. This is a mental illness and an emotional illness, and you need help. And that help is not going to come until one, you admit to yourself that you have a problem, and two, you're willing to put in the work to actually get help. So I would absolutely recommend anyone to come clean about their problems to their loved ones. Your family loves you, your friends love you. Nobody wants to see you in pain. I was overwhelmed by the amount of love and support that I got from my family, from my wife's family, from my parents, from my siblings, from my friends. Everything that I convinced myself would happen, the exact opposite happened. But I felt a massive burden off my shoulders because of all the love and support that I got when I came clean. You're hiding this major illness from everyone around you, and you can't get help until you actually are honest with yourself. No one, with gambling, we convince ourselves that the only thing that's going to help our problems is more gambling. You don't tell someone, who has cancer that the only thing that they need to get better is more cancer. But with gambling and with addiction, we just think we just need to keep masking our problems and keep drowning our sorrows in alcohol and drugs and gambling. The moment I came clean, my life changed. And I would absolutely advise anyone who's struggling out there to seek help, to be honest with yourself that you have a problem, that you cannot do this on your own. And the day that you come clean, I guarantee you your life will change for the better.
Wow. So you need two more questions before we hit to our lightning round. Number one, since you've sort of started to open up about this, become a voice in our community, speaking in different places, can you talk about some of the reactions that you've gotten that you find most illuminating that you want to share with us?
And the reactions have all been overwhelmingly positive. I'm still new at this, right? I did a podcast, a gambling podcast a couple months ago. I was on the Amudim Unite to Heal telethon. I've spoken at at a school to parents and to students, and now I'm speaking to you. So I'm still fairly new at this, but the reaction I got has been obviously really overwhelmingly positive. I still have a problem with some of it because people are highlighting my bravery and my courage for doing this. While I appreciate that, I don't feel like I'm doing anything brave or courageous. If anything, I think my family and those around me are the ones who are brave and courageous for the love and support they've given me. I'm just going out there sharing my story and trying to remove the stigma around gambling and around addiction. This is a mental illness, and the more that I could talk about it and hopefully tell kids, what I went through so that they don't have to go through the same thing, or other parents who might be hiding certain things or going through similar stories, you know, all I want to do is use my story to help others. I don't find like I'm doing anything brave or courageous. You know, I'm okay with it being public now because I'm hoping that it helps other people. But the reaction has been, you know, full of love, full of support, and people are really appreciative that I'm sharing my story.
hmm One of the scenes that you described is you described sort of being in your car on your phone, surrounded by sort of your dream life, wife and kids around you, and yet the only thing that you could focus on, think about, that I think taking up your mind and heart is the gambling addiction. And it's one of the themes of this conversation that you speak about how it's not just about the addiction, it's about the life that you're living or not living, the emptiness inside. So maybe on like a brighter note, can you maybe give some perspective on the importance of not just the Sur Meira, which has been most of the topic of this conversation, but the Asay Tov, how parents, educators can really help people build strong young people, old people that are living fulfilling lives that are sort of more resilient and more protected against the dangers and vulnerabilities of addiction.
I think it just starts with education and it starts with like being open, right? This is not something that people have to hide behind. This is not something that makes you a bad person. We always grew up as you don't want to hang out with those kids, they're the drug addicts, or you don't want to hang out with those kids, they drink. You know, all these boys and all these kids are great kids, right? Ultimately, you know, it's removing the stigma around this and saying, things happen or people do things, people um experiment with certain things, it doesn't make you a bad person. And I think we have to have more conversation around this in schools, in shuls, in camps, especially just to remind these kids that this isn't getting you into trouble thing. This is not something that you're going to be punished for. This is something that, we were talking to you about because there's real dangers here, right? And it's getting them involved in other positive behaviors and positive experiences so that they don't have to chase or go, do these behaviors to get away from that life. I mean, like I said, when I came back, I felt like I was reborn, right? I have a loving family around me. I have amazing friends. I have a great job. There are things that people would dream of, but I was escaping from it because for whatever reason. But a lot of it was due to my addiction. So, I think it's living that life with positivity, with glass half full, and really trying to educate these kids about some of these decisions and how it can affect them later in life.
Wow. So this has been very, very special and full of so many important insights, and I really appreciate you coming and sharing them with us. We usually end off with a quick rapid fire, 3 short questions, 3 hopefully short answers. We're in the winter. We have nice long Friday nights. What do you like to do at that time?
I have to go to shul with my kids and have an amazing home cooked meal.
Amazing. And do you have a favorite sefer on the parsha or something that in general gives you sort of inspiration to find Hashem, to find the gratitude, to find the strength to live the new type of life that you're now living?
I started to, chazar on Silas Yesharim while I was in rehab, and the Gambling Anonymous program has this book called One Day at a Time, where every day is another kind of just one page that you read that kind of gets you in the mindset, and it reminds me a lot of Silas Yesharim. Is really just trying to rebuild and love that connection that I have with Hashem.
Amazing. And finally, if you were forced to quit your job, quit your industry, find a new job in something, a new area, maybe some dream job you had as a kid to do when you grow up, what would that be?
I would say probably a doctor or a surgeon. That was always my goal, was to be a doctor, but then organic chemistry got in the way of that. Um, I work in the industry. I work with a lot of doctors, but I'm always envious of some of these incredible surgeons and the lives that they're saving. So I would say somewhere in the medical field,
Okay, amazing. Uri,
or a hockey player, or a professional hockey player.
I was hoping, I was waiting for that answer for a good Torontonian. So, Uri, thank you for coming on. Thank you for sharing. And Akash Baruch will continue to bless you with strength and to continue doing the holy work that you've now embarked on. And wishing all of our listeners a Purim Sameach, a safe Purim, a happy Purim. and should have everyone should just have Soros Tovos and Aslacha.
Amen. Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.